Welcome back to the Convo Couch, my humans. I am Pasta Jardula.
And I'm Fiorella.
And Jonny Sue is still spitting on those ones and twos. And today we have a great guest. I am so excited. She is an activist, and she is the senior editor of the Black Agenda Report. Today on the couch via satellite, we have Margaret Kimberley with us. How you doing, Margaret?
I'm doing fine. It's great to be here.
I love your hair. It's awesome today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. It didn't look so awesome at the end of that period of time when the beauty salons were a couple of weeks ago. You would have said that.
That's true.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, it looks good today. So let's jump into it. I was really excited to have you on the show. You know about imperialism. You always talk about imperialism. Every time I listen to you, it's like, wow, Margaret Kimberley is on fire. She's really speaking truth to light. We go out a lot to these protests, whatnot, and we're foreign policy people. And a lot of people don't know about it. They don't learn about it. And what they've been taught in school, the programming is pretty intense to make us think like we're Captain America, this American exceptionalism. But you recently said in an interview in RT that we can't have justice at home unless we have justice abroad. Please explain to our audience what you actually mean by that. And then furthermore, if you can take it another step and tell us how we get these protests in the street and the movement to evolve to understand that we need justice abroad to get justice home.
Sure. Well, what you're talking about is propaganda. We are propagandized from the time we're little kids, when we're in school. We're propagandized by the corporate media. Even people who want to be well-informed, who, if you read the New York Times and the Washington Post and listen to NPR and watch MSNBC, you still don't know what you need to know about foreign policy. But let's just talk about something that I think everybody is aware of or should be aware of. The defense budget is 60% of the federal budget, 60%. That means the money that is spent for the U.S. to have some 800 military bases abroad, the money that is spent on the bombs and the aircraft carriers and the fighter jets eats up most of the budget. So, of course, there's no money for the things we need. There's no money for housing, no money for infrastructure, no money for education. We can see from this pandemic, there's no money for the Centers for Disease Control. To have handled this pandemic much earlier, much better, and prevented this terrible loss of life. So the U.S. as this hegemon, as this empire, is literally taking the things we need. It's why we can't have nice things.
Yeah.
And that means we have to talk about peace. We have to question, why does the U.S. still have troops in Germany? Why does the U.S. still have troops in Korea? Why does, 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Soviets took their troops out of Eastern Germany, U.S. troops are still in Europe? Why? Why is it that coming on 70 years at the end of the Korean War, why are there thousands of troops in Korea? And the answer is to maintain this empire. It's to control to try to control the rest of the world. Excuse me. And as Eisenhower told us, it is the military-industrial complex. There are individuals, there are corporations who make a lot of money on war and on preparations for war. And we can't have the things that we need as long as this is true. And we can't have, by the way, literally, we have the military being brought onto American streets. There's a program, It's called the 1033 program, which gives surplus defense equipment to police departments. So police departments in big cities and podunks have armored vehicles.
Yeah.
Local cops look like soldiers, have been turned into soldiers. So these are just some of the ways in which U.S. foreign policy impacts our lives here.
Yeah. And many of the leftists here, unfortunately, right now are arguing for Joe Biden because he's, to a lot of people, the lesser of evils. He's less of a fascist. They always cite the Supreme Court saying, how dare you, let the Supreme Court go into flames, and the environment. They like to cite the environment as well, especially when people like leaders like Angela Davis have said, you have to, do this and get Trump out of office. A lot of people like to say, well, if he said it or if Noam Chomsky said it, then you guys have no argument. But given Joe Biden's record, specifically on foreign policy, do you think that he is the lesser of evils, or does that even matter at this point?
No, he's not. I mean, he said so. For example, U.S. sanctions. The U.S. sanctions countries it doesn't like, prevents them from performing financial transactions with anybody in the world. So Iran, for example, Iran can't buy food and medicine for its people. And Biden has already, and there are people who ask, can't we at least suspend sanctions for humanitarian reasons? And Biden replied something like, well, the Iranians could be lying. So he has said he's not going to resume this Iran deal, which was a big thing for the Obama administration, for God's sake. He's not going to bring it back. He's not going to move the U.S. embassy out of Jerusalem.
Yep.
He's going to maintain sanctions against Venezuela. His Venezuela policy is the same. He and Trump outdo each other, talking about who's going to be tougher on China. Mm-hmm. So he's already made it clear that foreign policy isn't going to change. How much will domestic policy change? What did they just do with one of these farcical committees? They said no Medicare for all. Yeah. Again, people are going to go broke because they get sick, or go without. Millions of people unemployed because of COVID-19, who in the middle of a pandemic don't have insurance. So, and as far as people like Angela Davis has been voting for Democrats for years. So her days of being a Marxist radical are long past. And somebody wrote an article a couple of weeks ago. Can you really claim to be more radical than Angela Davis? Well, I'm not voting for the Democrats, so yes. And there's no one you can't question. You can give credit where it's due to people like her, to Noam Chomsky, but you don't have to do what they tell you to do. Yeah. The system we live in a failed state. And to put on these little Band-Aids because, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies, we'll get another Democratic Supreme Court choice in there, is no reason for us to celebrate the prospect of Biden being president. And I'm not even convinced that necessarily that he'll win. So,
yeah. I think it's worse because, it's just like, once again, pretending to the mainstream that the Democrats are the party of the working people and, for social justice, but then they turn around and they screw you, especially when it comes to voting on policy. Let's talk about this one right here. I mean, you're affiliated with the Black Alliance for Peace, which has a zero tolerance for funding the military-industrial complex. And I believe your group has also demanded that they cut the military budget and they stop militarizing the police. However, Congress couldn't even, it failed. They couldn't even pass a 10% cut. Not to mention that with the NDAA, with the Foreign Affairs Committee, led by Liz Cheney, just shot down 4 amendments that were anti-imperialist. In other words, the amendment that said that Trump had to write a report about why he pulled out the INF, Liz Cheney says no, all the Democrats got in line. Donald Trump wants to end the Afghan war. I can't believe I'm even saying that, but he says he wants to pull out troops by the end of the year. Liz Cheney says no, Seth Moulton and the Democrats get behind him. And the other two as well, he wants to pull troops out of Germany because, probably because he doesn't want to deal with NATO and it's something personal from Trump, but still, he wants to pull troops out of Germany, which we're talking about for so long. He can't do that. So in all 4 amendments, they literally shot him down. Okay, so from an imperialistic view, not just Joe Biden, the Democrats alone in Congress, isn't it bad to give them back power the way they act when they just fall in line with Liz Cheney and the Republicans?
Sure, it's terrible. But another problem is that causes this. We've had progressives like Bernie Sanders. On foreign policy, he's not progressive.
Right.
So people have been told, even people who think about these things say, well, if I got Medicare for all, I could live with the fact that, he's still calling the former president of Venezuela a dead communist dictator. I can deal with that. Or he talks about getting tough with Russia or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's been a problem because even when we have people who are progressive, somewhat progressive with domestic policy, They're not at all progressive in foreign policy. So it's been disappeared. There used to be, I'm old enough to remember, there were always a few lefties in Congress. There were always a few Democratic lefties who would buck their leadership, who would speak up. But they're gone. Kucinich is gone. Other people have been who've been out for years. And so progressives in general we shrink and shrink and shrink what we want in this country. And so these issues are taken off the table. We're told they're impossible. We're told it's something you can't have. And with Trump being president, Trump is a perfect foil for Democrats. They can get away with so much. All they do is point to him. Yeah. So do you want Trump? It doesn't matter what you question, what the issue is, what you're talking about. Oh, so you'd prefer to have Trump, would you? And I think we have to have the answer, no, but we don't want you either, because you're failing us. And so, and creating chaos and death all over the world. Yeah. Why is there still a war in Afghanistan? It was bogus to begin with. Mm-hmm. They only got one member of Congress, Barbara Lee, to vote against it back after 9/11.
UMF. Yeah.
So the people we were told who plotted the terror attacks were in Germany or somewhere, but we had to attack Afghanistan. Yeah. So thousands of people dead in Afghanistan, thousands of troops who've been deployed there. Americans have lost their lives. Our tax dollars being spent, and we're told it has to go on. We have to have these forever wars, which is one of the reasons I think Trump squeaked through in the Electoral College. I think he peeled away some votes for Hillary Clinton when he said he was opposed to these forever wars. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know that he really is. He's certainly no lefty. He's not the peace candidate, but the system will not allow any deviation from permanent warfare, from enriching the military-industrial complex. If you go to Washington and you're in the Washington subway system, their metro, you see ads from defense contractors. McDonnell Douglas and Raytheon have ads in the subway. Like in New York, it's for ads for you to buy stuff. I mean, if that doesn't tell you who runs the country, I don't know what does.
And they are all using Russia still, the media and Congress, all these decisions. Oh, we can't do that because of Russia. So,
yeah, Russia's military budget is something like 10% of the U.S. military budget. It is minuscule. The amount of money they spend. They're not the ones with the bases, 800 bases all over the world. They have a handful. And frankly, for the sake of the world, it's a good thing that they came in Syria and said, no, you can't decide who runs Syria. It is a good thing when the U.S. is opposed, when countries step forward and say, no, you can't do that here. We need a multipolar world. But that Russiagate, that whole thing was cooked up. It was so cynical. There is no proof of any Russian collusion. Mueller ended his investigation with indictments over Facebook memes or something like that. That was essentially it after 2 years of being told about Russian collusion. Process crimes, people who were tricked into lying to the FBI, which is a crime in and of itself, but none of the things that we were told. And it has been used to shut people up, to shut down dissent, and to prevent any change from this neoliberal imperialist system that we have.
And for a lot of people on the left, one of the questions in fighting the establishment always comes down to race versus class. A lot of people kind of feel like you can't do one, you can't do both, that you have to do one or the other, citing that maybe one is more important. What's your take on this? Because I see that both race and class are two mechanisms used by the system and the oligarchy to turn us against one another so that we don't look up and see that obviously it is the elites that are in power.
There Well, this whole idea of class reductionism, am I getting the expression right? That everything's about class, and if you got rid of capitalism, there wouldn't be any problems, therefore diminishing the role of racism. Right. But America is so racist that your race determines what class you're going to be in. It's no surprise that low-wage workers tend to be people of color. I mean, that is not, if class were the sole issue, there would be diversity. at the top. There would be diversity at the bottom, but we don't see that. So we have to talk about race. America is fundamentally racist. That's the founding of the country. But we have to talk about these class issues as well. But it's hard to talk about class when white people get a leg up, even now, as the system collapses, even now that people have less and less opportunity, wage stagnation, people out of work, white workers are still get a better deal than Black people get. So it's difficult even to talk about class when the country is so racist and when racism helps some people, and even people who may have thought of it, who may have good intentions. It's another thing altogether to do away with the advantages that people experience in a very real way. So I don't think we should let ourselves get into those arguments so much. We have to help everybody. I think that's another thing that will stop racism in this country. Many white people don't want any benefit, even to themselves, if it's sold as something that will help Black people. So there are people who are against government spending because it only helps Black people. Well, it would help you too. So I don't think there's this clean division that some people want to make.
And how do we do that? How do we tackle racism while simultaneously pointing to how we all suffer when under late stage capitalism?
I just do it. Just talk about all of it. This was used to foist Joe Biden on us. Black people were told, you may want Medicare for all, but white people may not want it. You can't trust them to vote for Bernie Sanders. So if he's the nominee, white people will still vote for Trump. Now, I don't believe that's true. I think if people were told this, you are going to get this benefit, I think most white people would have voted for it. So this was used by the establishment, the people who at Black Agenda Report, we call the Black misleaders, that political class. They used that to manipulate Black people into voting against our interests and to diminishing the things that we need to see in our lives. So I think it's important to just to keep talking about it. And when we see this propaganda that was used to convince people to vote against their interests, we have to call it out. So I don't think we have to worry about emphasizing one or the other. Talk about all of it.
Let's stick on that subject because I have a couple questions on, when it comes to that. When you talk about, white people do have a better advantage than people of color, but isn't it still the elites who put that system into play to divide us against each other, and we have to pay close attention to that? In other words, what I'm saying is that, and I don't want to be insensitive, but sometimes I feel it's more important out there in these rallies where people are trying to get the message that culturally we have to understand each other, and that is the big issue, but we lose sight of the fact that the elites and the oligarchs, the one who put all these systems in play to keep us divided so they can get the money, they get away with it. You know what I'm saying? In other words, whether we like it or not, and a lot of people won't even admit the fact because they turned a blind eye to this, the CARES Act, which left so many poor people out in the cold, it's going to kill a lot more people than the cops will because it's going to kick people out of their house, give them no health care, and therefore, once again, it's the money that's transferred up the top to the elites, and they're walking free.
Oh, they are. They've gotten richer since the COVID pandemic. They're doing just fine. So I think you are right, but I think the way around that is, as I said, to advocate for all of us, to advocate for everybody. Americans, because we don't have nice things, because we don't have the benefits that people have in other countries. It's a dog-eat-dog system. So, for example, I know people who ought to know better who get angry. They're like, well, why do they get Medicaid? And I have health insurance, but I still have a big copay. Why should they? Give to everybody.
Yeah.
Have a system like every other. America's always putting itself in the realm of the developed nations, the democratic nations, the advanced nations. but we're very backwards. And if we had the systems like they have in Canada right next door, and if everybody had health insurance, regardless of how much they made, regardless of whether they worked or not, if everybody had the same level playing field and was given access to what should be a right, I think that would get rid of a lot of this resentment between classes, between races, so that you don't have people who they get a little bit and they're angry and they're resentful if anybody else gets help. I really do believe that will go a long way towards diminishing racism, but that's why they don't do it. Because if they did, then people would look at them, people would look up, and they would say, well, how are they doing? How is it that the billionaires who, I mean, something like I can't remember the exact statistic, the richest people in the world have as much money as half of all humanity, some crazy
Ridiculous
figure like that. But that's why they talk people out of, and they use a variety of schemes to talk people out of advocating for the things they need, turning folks against each other.
Yeah.
I mean, well, what about the older crowd? Because when you talk about American exceptionalism, you know, they didn't have the internet growing up, like, you know, and whatnot. So, I mean, I think there's a lot more people who kind of like, hey, listen, I'm not going to let my schooling get in the way of my education, and I'm going to go out and seek the truth. But that wasn't the case with the older generation. How do we get them to understand that America's, excuse my French, shit does stink, and we are not exceptional the way we kind of come off like we are?
Well, you know, it's a difficult thing because people like my age and up, we got the better deal. I was able to go to college, even a private college, without spending a lot of money, mostly scholarship. I was able to do it. I couldn't do it now with private college. Even mediocre private colleges cost $60,000 a year. So people my age, we got jobs when you could still have a defined benefit pension. We went to college when it wasn't super expensive. So there is an age divide as well, where people my age have a little bit, we're a little better off. We knew we would, I mean, the idea of having a job that didn't come with benefits or not being able to find full-time work or this gig economy crap was not something we had to deal with. And so it's hard sometimes for people my age and up to see what it is that young people are going through. They have an entirely different reality.
Yeah.
And I hate it. I read these articles about millennials aren't getting married. They're not buying houses. They're not having kids. Well, duh. How can they? How can that happen for them? So I think this generational divide needs to be addressed as well. And I think we can keep it simple. Just tell people, listen, you know, you got a little more when you were coming up. Don't you want younger people, your kids or your nieces and nephews, don't you want them to have living wage work, to have the things that you, that there was no question you would get? And I think we need to shake things up that way. But that's something that young people need to say also, and they can't be afraid to confront those of us who are older.
The young kids nowadays, they're lazy. They watch all these shows, the Kardashians. They need to go out and get a job.
And that's part of it too, is the fact that we have a huge problem with symbolism in America. I mean, Americans love their symbols. Our politicians do nothing but give us platitudes and symbolic gestures without actually ever getting like tangible results. An example of this are the statues or the Me Too movement. While I'm for the removal of statues, do you get defunding the police with that? Do you get any actual change in policy? No. And so how do we make Americans go out in the streets and march for economics as easily as they do for, say, like a march against Donald Trump wearing pussy hats? Like, how do we get people to focus on the things that would actually help women, economic changes, etc.?
I think we have to stick with the basics. It's it's easy to be, and these distractions are not by accident. You know, the pink pussy hat, that was a big Democratic Party thing because they screwed up and let Trump win. And I've always maintained that Trump's victory is a fault of the Democratic Party. They want to distract with trivialities, but we can't be distracted by the trivialities. And I think we can talk about issues like the police. Like defunding the police actually is a problematic thing because we've already seen cities like here in New York, the mayor with some budgetary smoke and mirrors claiming to have defunded the police when he didn't. He didn't cut the police budget. Basically, they have school safety officers who are paid by the NYPD, and they took those budget lines out of the NYPD and put them in the Department of Education and said, see, we've cut the NYPD's budget. So I think we have to be careful. I think our demand should be for community control of the police. I just wanted to say that very quickly. But I think it's all part of a whole. You know, the taking down of the statues is it's important. It means that people are not accepting these old narratives anymore. People are not afraid to say the founding fathers were pieces of crap. 10 of the first 12 presidents were slaveholders. Yep. No, I'm not. And I don't care that their face is on the money. We need to start talking about the foundations of this country. So I think that's an important thing to do. I don't think that can be the sole focus, and I don't think it keeps anyone from working towards community control of the police and changing policing, and not to advocate for things that, despite our best intentions, may not actually be in our interest. So we can do it all. It is all important. I don't think the statues are a trivial issue. Of course, changing policing. This movement started because of police brutality, because of George Floyd's murder, which led people who were unhappy about some of the other things we've talked about. The suffering. People are suffering in this country, and it's never acknowledged. The corporate media doesn't talk about it. Politicians don't talk about it. The fact that that people don't have, that half of Americans are low-wage workers, half.
Yeah.
But it's not an issue. The minimum wage, is Biden talking about raising the minimum wage? No, even Bernie Sanders, his minimum wage proposal was minimal. It would go up to $15 an hour after 5 years, and $15 isn't enough now. But let's talk about all of it. I think we need to, and I think this is connected with what you were saying before, how people know what they're unhappy about, but aren't well informed. And I think we need organizing. That's what they had back in, we fetishized the 60s and the civil rights movement and the changes that came about at that time, but people were organized and they had coherent, concrete demands. We want the vote. We need a Voting Rights Act. We need discrimination to be illegal. So I think we have to, even as things have worsened since that time, I believe that we can prove it, that we have to have coherent demands. We have to talk with one another, and we have to fight too. People can be protesting and they can still debate things, but that's okay. That's not a reason to give up on each other.
Yeah. You have a follow-up? I'm gonna go to next.
Go ahead.
All right, so you have a lot of geopolitical knowledge on China. And I remember when I was growing up, around the dinner table in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a serious talk about the Cold War in Russia.
Right.
Well, I don't see that serious talk today when it comes to China. In fact, I think a lot of people are just so ignorant to what really is going on in China. And you're talking a lot about it right now. But how do we elevate this conversation to the mainstream? Because this is a serious issue. Yeah. I think people don't realize a Cold War with China. They see Trump just puffing his chest up and removing the consulate from Houston. But a Cold War with China, and even a hot war with China, it's no bueno right now. And, the times have changed. How do we elevate this conversation to the mainstream and get a serious conversation going?
Well, that's why we have to oppose the Democratic Party, because Biden says the same things as Trump. Accusing Trump of being too cozy with China, and he says the Democrats are too. I mean, it's just stupid. And COVID-19 has made people stupider. Is that a word? Stupider.
That's a good word.
Thank you. Blaming China for this virus. I mean, the information is there. China, within a month, I mean, I think it's pretty amazing. Within a month, China realized they had a communicable disease on their hand. They identified it. They sequenced the genome. They came up with the test. They did all that in like 5 or 6 weeks. We cannot blame them. If people are dying here, it's not because of China, but that goes back to the other issue where foreign policy has been taken off the table. Yeah. And people, if you follow the duopoly, if you follow the two political parties, there's some differences around the edges, but basically they say the same thing. It's one of many reasons we've got to get rid of this lesser evil business. And the sooner we do, the better. And yes, we can say, I don't care what Noam Chomsky says, I'll give credit for something else, but no, I'm not voting for a Democrat. And that way we can elevate these discussions. And we have to educate ourselves. You know, there were, I was a kid at the time, but I remember the teach-ins. People educated themselves about Vietnam. They knew they were being lied to. They knew Congress wasn't telling them the truth. They knew the press weren't telling them the truth. And they made the effort to educate themselves. I think we have to reach back to some of those folks some of them are still around, about how that was done. The Panthers did it. That's one of the reasons they crushed the Black Panthers, because that's one of the things they did. So I think we have to find ways of educating ourselves. You mentioned I'm affiliated with Black Alliance for Peace. That's one of the things that we do with our chapters in several cities. Our goal is to educate people. And this is a great time for it. You know, on the one hand, I'm like, oh, every day is another webinar, sometimes 5 times a day, 6 times a day. It's like, oh my God, I can't keep up with these webinars, but it is a tool. It is a way for us to educate ourselves and to educate other people. But first, people have to turn against this duopoly. And as long as you think that the only thing standing between you and an apocalypse is Joe Biden being president, then it's difficult to get people to listen to anything.
And on that note, how do we, because progressives are still trying to work within the Democratic Party. I mean, we just saw what happened with the DNC committee, where they denied Medicare for all, they denied marijuana legalization, and yet people are still trying to work within that. I mean, given the last 2 elections too, and how much of a sham those elections were, how do we convince people to leave when their answer is like, well, there's really not a set structure for third parties to exist? A lot of people are like, well, I'll leave if we can get a third party to have the same equilibrium, the same power as the Democratic and Republican Party. But how do you get people to leave? Because they still continue saying, we're still going to vote for Democrats into Congress. We're still going to do this. Meanwhile, we're not building something outside that could actually be in opposition to the Democratic Party.
Right. You have to build first. And I think you have to tell people you can't be afraid. If you just look at what the Democrats have given you, stop acting like it's nirvana. It isn't. And I think we have to be less afraid and start the building now. We do have a system that's hostile to third parties and renders them to, they're relegated to spoiler status. But my response to that is get rid of the Democrats. Let's have a real people's party, a real peace party, a real workers' party. But so what are you afraid of? What do you get with these Democrats? I think it could happen relatively quickly. And as far as working within the Democratic Party, they don't want to change. What are you working for? They have said they rigged the primary again to make sure that not only was Bernie Sanders not the nominee, but that none of the issues he was raising would ever be brought up in this election cycle. So what is it that you're working for? So I think we have to put people on the spot and say, what do we get if Biden is president? People will still go broke because they get sick. We will still have, and if you can't cut the military budget even 10%, I mean, it's already huge. It's bigger than I think it's the next 6 or 7 countries. If you combined their military budgets, they're still smaller than the U.S. budget is. If they can't cut it 10%, if they can't really change anything, it's stop being so fearful. Stop it. And remember, and we talk about the civil rights movement this week. John Lewis is being buried, and everybody talks about the freedom rides. Well, do what they did. They worked outside of the system. People gained the right to vote when they couldn't vote. Most Black people lived in the South and didn't have the right to vote, but they are the ones who got the franchise for themselves without electoral politics. So I think we have to remember that the greatest changes have always come about outside of the system. Yeah. And if we're going to lionize those people, and if we're going to fetishize that time, let's remember what people really did. They made demands on the politicians. They didn't say, I'm going to work with the politicians. They said, this is our demand. And they stuck with it, and they moved in action. They moved as one and got what they wanted to get. So let's stop that if we're ever going to, and we can't be shy about telling people also what they do get. We can't be afraid to say, well, okay, so when the first 2 years of Obama's term and Democrats controlled everything, the White House, both houses of Congress. Yeah, what do people say? Well, Obamacare. So you got this bill which extended. The best thing about it was the Medicaid expansion. Frankly, everybody else got the right to buy insurance that still is too expensive. But what did they do? Did they raise the minimum wage? No. Did they resolve anything else? No. So this great day, this great thing that was supposed to be like the second coming of Christ was really very little. And I think we have to be brave and tell people. And it's always hard to do because as soon as you do that, Trump says, something horrendous and horrible. He's such a uniquely vile person. He silences a lot of people, but we can't be fooled by that either.
100%.
But Trump, I got to tell you, about a year ago, I heard somebody float for president. They said you and a Jamu, and I was like all happy. I was jumping all over that. I really wish we had that ticket today because you're amazing when it comes to not just social and racial issues, but your imperialism and the way you tie things in. It really was a pleasure to talk to you today. Jonny, do you got something for Miss Kimberley? Anything else?
No, this is great.
Well, let's tell everybody out there where we can find Margaret Kimberley and what she's up to.
First, my book. Yes. I'll put it up to my head. Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents. You can get it on Amazon. If you've got Amazon issues, you can buy it directly from the publisher, Steerforth Press, steerforth.com. You can find my columns at blackagendareport.com. And I'm on Twitter at Freedom Ride Blog. And patreon.com/Margaret Kimberley.
Yeah. And you do a show with Danny Haifong sometimes, right?
We do. We've only had, I think we've had 2 episodes, and the guy who edits is on vacation, so it's going to be a couple more weeks.
There's no vacations now.
Yeah.
It's almost August. The Left Lens, Black Agenda Report presents The Left Lens. So just look up The Left Lens on YouTube. And Danny has a great interview this week with David West, former NBA player, which people will be interested in.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting because the whole Uyghur situation was kind of brought to attention from the NBA when they were in China, and they had the whole thing where there were some people holding up signs, do you know the Uyghurs? That made me dive in to go find out what was about the Uyghurs talking about.
Well, it's all a lie. There are no concentration camps with Uyghurs. There's no evidence. There is none. It is a lie. And it's one of the biggest lies. It's being used it's war propaganda. And we mentioned China and the hostility people have towards China. They always make up something about a human rights violation because that gets people in the mood for war.
I think we're going to have a China episode.
Yeah. I mean, well, people they're not even presented with all the evidence. Yeah. They're not even presented with who's putting those claims out there as far as the Uyghurs. It's an anti-communist guy. And most of the Uyghur stuff comes directly from him and him only. They don't understand about the history of that region. of about Operation Mongoose. Once again, American imperialism funding the Mujahideen through China with Uyghurs. And so I say, let's present all the information and then let people make their own opinions, because that's the problem nowadays. Margaret Kimberley, you are amazing. I hope you come on with us again. We love your style. We love your hair. Please do it with us again.
Thank you so much, Margaret. We appreciate you.
Come back. Thanks, guys.
Keep up the good fight.
Pasta Jardula.
And Fiorella.
Jonny Sue on the ones and twos. In the house with Margaret Kimberley.
Convo out. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.